Hello, and welcome to episode number 77 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. While the push towards government disclosure around its knowledge of UFOs and even its knowledge of the attempted reverse engineering of apparently recovered craft of anomalous origin really is kicking into a higher gear of late, it's still a far cry from the kinds of matters that the people known as experiencers are concerned with. Experiencers, those who have witnessed and interacted with anomalous phenomena personally, including those who've had actual encounters with beings of a decidedly non-conventionally human variety, are dealing with the way these experiences have changed them. That is to say, the question of UFOs and aliens is no longer an open question for these people. That matter is settled, while the public debate rages on. What experiencers have largely moved on to is how to make sense of these experiences and how to incorporate them into their daily reality. No small task when one considers just how life-altering such experiences can be. One key aspect of the encounters experiencers report has to do with messages received from the beings coming from elsewhere, whether one sees that as an extraterrestrial, interdimensional, extratempestrial, or extradimensional in nature. If there is one theme that arises more than any other in these reported encounters, it's one dealing with warnings and admonitions around a dawning cataclysm of some sort, supposedly arising in the not-too-distant future of human civilization. Sometimes these warnings and admonitions are more symbolic in nature, such as when contactees/abductees are shown images of the Earth on fire, or when, for instance, one particular person saw an image of what looked like the Earth as an organism experiencing labored breathing. Other times the message or vision is laid out more plainly, when, for instance, giant waves are seen engulfing the coasts, or when an extraplanetary object is seen smashing into the Earth from outer space. Taken alone, these messages and visions are concerning enough, so much so that some experiencers have historically started changing lifestyle because they have expected this massive shift in Earth affairs to be imminent. But the thing is, the UFO phenomenon experiencers literature is not the only source for these kinds of messages and visions. One need look no further than our religious history to see that various scriptural texts, which are of course ultimately derived from the accounts of anomalous encounters from distant history, also attest to these same themes, both in terms of beginnings, such as in the Genesis account and its older Babylonian and Sumerian sources, as well as in prophesied endings, like what we find in apocalyptic literature, such as the New Testament's Book of Revelation. And then we have the geological and archaeological records that leave similar tantalizing clues, perhaps even suggesting that this notion of cataclysm is actually part of a recurring cycle, perhaps even one whose repeated arising is coming due again soon. Is this what ancient ruins and whisperings of former advanced civilizations like Atlantis are pointing towards? Many would suggest this is indeed the case, and that the writing is on the proverbial wall, even if that's in the form of ancient cave paintings. But what are we to make of all of this? Why are human beings being shown images of seeming impending doom, without being given requisite knowledge regarding how to avoid it? And how does this repeated message of the need for us to raise our vibration, quote-unquote, come into play? Is this about advancing our level of collective consciousness so as to be able to avoid this apocalypse? Or is it about preparing ourselves for the dimensional shift that will happen, at least potentially, immediately afterwards? Tricky waters to navigate, to be sure, but that's precisely what we'll attempt to do in this, the 77th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. On one of the most recent episodes of Liminal Frames, I talked about how starkly different the conversations being had in nuts and bolts circles are from those being had amongst experiencers. A major aspect of experiencer accounts, which has seen a dramatic uptick in recent years and even months, has to do with the notion of a coming cataclysm. Before we continue here, though, I want to address some people's concerns that to even talk about an event like a cataclysm unnecessarily triggers people and thus does more harm than good, and should therefore be avoided altogether. Personally, this is not the way I think about these things. I think truth is our friend, always, even when it's inconvenient. And because I see this lifetime as just one lifetime amongst many, I am not putting all of my existential eggs in this one basket, the basket of this lifetime. Furthermore, when you consider the notion of pre-incarnative decisions chosen before this lifetime that lead to the growth opportunity of an underlying soul, to avoid discussion of these matters may very well be to miss the true point of the entire exercise altogether. In other words, sometimes these trigger warnings arise from a physicalist mentality in terms of this lifetime being all there is. I reject that notion, and I think we should therefore discuss these kinds of events because they always have underlying metaphysical meaning, I would suggest. Now let's begin by talking about experiencer premonitions. When we think about cataclysms, that's one of the first things that comes to mind. I personally hear from many friends and acquaintances of the experiencer sort who are having premonitions ongoingly of various kind of cataclysmic events. And this has seen an uptick recently. Some people have dreams about this, sometimes have daytime visions, etc. And what are the nature of these? Well, sometimes they're floods, sometimes they involve magnetic or tectonic shifts in the earth, which as a consequence can cause flooding. Now, experiencers for some time now have felt this need to get away from the coast, to move to higher ground. In fact, even when I was in New York, that topic got raised, that subject, this notion that the coasts don't feel entirely safe, especially in light of these dreams, visions of impending apocalypse. Now, it's important to point out that these are not always negative in nature, these visions, these premonitions, nor without a sense of overarching guidance in the midst of these coming earth changes. In other words, while we sometimes hear about experiencers encountering beings who show them these kinds of visions of impending doom, with the earth going through some sort of destruction or great distress, they're not always left with no sense of what the purpose is or what they can do about it. That happens sometimes, to be sure, and sometimes there's kind of this sense of this vague, you need to raise your vibration message being passed on, and people don't really have a sense of what that involves. We'll get to that shortly, but I also want to discuss situations where experiencers are shown images of impending doom or impending distress in the earth civilization, and around climate change and things like that. But again, sometimes they are given messages and given guidance about how to navigate these things, how to navigate these waters, so to speak, in terms of a flood. And we should also point out that it's not always a complete cataclysm in terms of the end of our civilization. There's a bit of variance there. Sometimes it's a massive event we have to go through, but it's something we can survive and see on the other side. Other times it more is like a civilization or greatly civilization changing event. Now, in an early podcast on this Point of Convergence podcast, I talked about the case of Susie Hansen. Now, she is your typical situation where she initially had a shocking event where she was abducted with a friend right from their car up into a craft. The entire car was taken up. And at first she had that kind of shocking feeling of what's happening, and it was terrifying. But to her surprise, she later realized she recognized the beings on the craft and that she had had long-term associations with them. In fact, she had memory of being with them before this lifetime. And again, we have to keep this big picture in mind whenever we're talking about these things. Now, in her book, The Dual Soul Connection, Susie Hansen talks about basically being given decades of training by these grays, by these non-human others, in preparation not just for the next life, but also in preparation for something that's going to happen during this lifetime in the world. And I now want to quote from the book. This is The Dual Soul Connection, which is subtitled The Alien Agenda for Human Advancement. Quote, "In February 2010, I retained memory of attending a somewhat disturbing meeting with hundreds of other people in an underground facility." Unquote. Now that sets the stage in terms of where she was when this event is about to take place. And I want to jump forward in the book when she talks about what she was actually exposed to, what actually happened while she was in that underground facility, basically ready to take part in a training. I'm going to jump ahead now to when she was seeing images of apocalypse, cataclysm, along with other human beings who were in the facility for the training. Quote, images began flashing on the screen, initially one every few seconds or so. However, as our concentration was established and maintained, this then increased to one image roughly every second, and then several images each second. There was no time to blink. We are registering them all, but we cannot dwell on any particular one because of the terrific speed. It makes my eyes jerk and water. Oh, they are tragic images, tragic images. And then in brackets, we see that she was crying and deeply disturbed by the images when she was talking about this in a regression afterwards. I ceased speaking altogether, and my entire body shook as if in a state of sudden shock. According to the regression therapist, I hyperventilated, and my teeth hammered together loudly for a full 2.5 minutes as I relived the intensity of hundreds of futuristic images. They depicted shocking natural disasters on our planet, extremes of weather, internal and internation wars, and chaos in societies, all involving massive loss of life and suffering, a stream of tragedy sending a bolt of terror through us all. Everyone was shaken, but our eyes remained fixed and riveted to the screen with tears streaming down our faces, as all within the space of a couple of minutes, we were given a dire insight, a warning of events to come on our planet. Then equally as quickly, the atmosphere switched as the images ended. And then she says to the regressionist, we are calming down now. He has cleared it away. Who has cleared it away? That's why this particular mantis entity is here. He's the one showing them. He's got some extraordinary ability, and I know it's coming from him. The entity sent out a telepathic blanket of calm that descended over us all, instantaneously soothing our jangled emotions with his mind as the shock dissipated, and we felt composed again. The understanding of what we had seen was still in our minds, but because of his influence, we could now think about the implications calmly and clinically and put emotions aside, unquote. Again, she's talking about the mantis being who was able to send this calm to them all that were witnessing these events, these premonitions of what was going to happen to the earth. Now we're going to jump to a section now where another human being is now explaining to them what's going to happen and what it all means. When we say human here, again, just to remind you, this doesn't necessarily mean Earth human. There are plenty of times where human-looking entities are encountered, but they're not actually Earth humans. But carrying on again from the book, quote, the human explained the futuristic images of Earth changes, wars, and societal upheaval were events that will occur. However, the timing, intensity, and duration may vary according to mankind's decisions in the interim. In other words, our mass consciousness and actions play a part in creating our collective future. Tragic events sometimes promote growth and change. He went on to say that as people who have been trained by the Greys, we were now being asked to take on a different role, that of tutoring for them. This was conveyed as a request, but at the same time, there was a subtle element of requiring us to do this. We understood it as not a threat or an imposition, but rather an expectation of commitment, and having seen tragic future portents affecting our civilization, our very consciences required us to cooperate, unquote. So just to quickly summarize what we just read, basically, over time, Susie Hansen, along with other humans, have been initially abducted, but then they realize it's not a negative thing. It's more like a contact, and it's connected to a pre-incarnative decision they made along with these others. And she was sort of waking up to her other aspect of herself when she was on board craft and in the presence of these others. And that's indeed why she calls this book The Dual Soul Connection, because she's part gray, part human, but sometimes the gray identity doesn't come online until she's with them. But either way, the notion here is that different humans are being prepared as ambassadors, if you will, to help other humans when these cataclysms do occur, when these events that are apocalyptic in nature do arise. I also want to point out there that she was told, along with others, that the exact timing was somewhat up in the air. And that's a major theme that I've come across time and time again, even in the raw material that we will discuss later, which I personally think is the best channeled material we've ever received from an extra-human source. They talk about that as well, that because of free will, human free will, and there being billions of us, that the exact timing is partly dependent on the decisions we make, the actions we take in the coming years. And so because there's this recognition and this valuing of free will, it's the intermix of all those things, the collective consciousness on the earth together, along with these things that were planned beforehand, which we'll get to, which ultimately determine the timing. So that is to say, even some of these others don't know the exact timing, but they do have a sense of the general thrust of what is to come. So before we move on to the next section, I want to again just highlight two important things here. Number one, the sense of a coming cataclysm is a major part of experiencer accounts, that this is very often central to these situations. Even the kids in Zimbabwe were shown images telepathically, told things that made them worry about Earth's future, and they were told that you need to change course, basically. So that's a key aspect of what goes on in these situations. But whereas those kids were not given really the tools to know what to do to prevent these things, there are other cases like here with Susie Hansen, where she and others are actually being trained specifically about how to help when these events eventually do arise. Okay, and that has to do with the experiencer accounts dealing with ETs, extraterrestrials, which is how these others identify themselves here. But the question is it only in these kind of experiencer accounts to do with ETs or interdimensionals that we hear about this notion of a coming cataclysm? Well, as it turns out, no, that's not the only place we hear about these things. This is not the only source. I mentioned that in the introduction. There's numerous other places, other kinds of sources that also point towards this sense of a coming cataclysm, that this is part of human history, and perhaps has even been cyclical in nature, that this would not be the first time this has happened, that in fact maybe there have been different civilizations on the Earth, perhaps even previous sophisticated civilizations, like Atlantis, like we talked about, that have since gone by the wayside. And it's kind of our hubris that leads us to believe we're the first ones here. But what are some of these other sources? Well, we need to look next to the extraterrestrials. Those of you tuning into this podcast for a long time, you'll remember that I dedicated 3 episodes to the notion of some groups of the Greys actually being us from the future, or what Michael Masters calls extraterrestrials, who are here now partly in relation to the notion of a coming cataclysm. Now, one group apparently is for this cataclysm. They're here to try and ensure it does happen, whereas another faction, another group of future humans is here to try to help us prevent it from happening in terms of choosing one timeline over another based on our actions. Now, the sense is that this is imminent, within a decade or less, I would generally say, and intelligence groups were trying to keep this under wraps, according to what I discussed in those 3 episodes, for fear that public knowledge alone could change the timeline and in a way that would not be good. Now, interestingly, former CIA analyst John Ramirez has spoken to the notion that for quite some time now, there has been knowledge within various intelligence circles that some kind of major event is coming. In fact, he suggested the change in tone that happened around 2017, around the time of the publication of those famous New York Times articles, was the kickoff to a 10-year preparation for a major public reveal of some kind. In other words, something that's coming online around 2027. Now, importantly, this reveal seems not to be about a cataclysm directly, but something else. One wonders, could this revelation be in relation to the presence of these extraterrestrials or extraterrestrials, which in the long run is related to this coming cataclysm? In other words, is 2027 the time where they will reveal themselves in a vast public way and then join forces with us to perhaps prepare for or prevent this cataclysm? Again, I think it's an open question of what's actually on the table here, and I'll leave that up to you to decide, but I just want to discuss some of the details that often come up. Now, Ramirez also stressed the idea, and I've heard this personally from other credible sources as well, that part of the reason for the cover-up of the Roswell event was because the beings recovered from the craft showed signs of having a genetic heritage in common with us. So here again, interesting possibilities arise. Could these have been the initial extraterrestrial voyages, if you will, going back in time and coming into our timeline and things going wrong? That's possible. Perhaps they weren't ETs, perhaps they were extraterrestrials, future humans. Or could this hint to our distant history being one that was connected to an extraterrestrial intelligence who seeded us? In other words, was the fact that they shared a genetic lineage with us to do with the fact that they seeded us? So they weren't necessarily us from the future, but ETs who have a common genetic linkage with us. And this was the notion that would have been shocking to the public and this supposedly was a big reason why the cover-up was so massive and so dedicated. So that's two sources so far. We've had the extraterrestrial or interdimensional encounters with experiencers and warnings about a coming cataclysm, and then sometimes some training and some preparation for this, like in the case of Susie Hansen. And we've also had the notion of extraterrestrials and supposedly intelligence sources that have been in contact with these extraterrestrials around a coming cataclysm. And these future humans are the ones that arise after this cataclysm, and that's partly why they look the way they do, etc. But now let's move on to another source that also touches on this notion of a coming cataclysm: religion. Now, a major long-term aspect of various religious traditions involves this notion of a future apocalypse, the so-called end times, followed by a new peaceful order on what is termed a new heaven and a new earth. Now, many people often interpret that in biblical circles, in Christian circles, as literally a new planet, but it perhaps is more like either a renewed planet or a dimensionally shifted planet, like what you learn about in the raw material. And this is, again, what's so interesting. We'll get to that in a moment. Notions like the raw material, channeled material from extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional beings, has a lot of similar themes as what we find in ancient religion, even this notion of a new earth. Now, here we should pause to point out that plenty of people have suggested, in regards to religion, and evidence certainly seems to point in this direction, that the intelligences influencing the seeding of those early religious traditions that later became dogmatic traditions were the very same intelligences behind contact encounters via the more modern UFO phenomenon literature in our time. That is to say, you could argue that this message from these same groups of beings has been part of the picture for us as long as we've been interacting with them, which you could argue was around the time of the seeding of our civilization on, or at least since our most recent genetic tweaks that made us capable of more advanced abstract thought and communication with them. Now, earlier I mentioned John Ramirez as a former CIA analyst saying that there was knowledge within the CIA and other intelligence circles about events in the future, things like a major event in 2027, and perhaps that has to do with a major reveal of some kind in terms of these others making their presence known on a wide public level, and that's perhaps why we see a shift in approach now by the government because they're preparing for this. And again, perhaps this change in focus began around 2017 in terms of a 10-year run-up to this reveal. But the CIA also has had hints, inklings of a coming cataclysm, you could argue. There's the famous case of a book called The Adam and Eve Story, which supposedly was at one point held back by the CIA, that they actually classified aspects of this. And supposedly, even today, while you can get a copy of this book on Amazon, for instance, supposedly aspects of it are still redacted. And you'd ask yourself, why would this be the case? This is a book that someone wrote, kind of just an average person, not well known, who wrote a book about cataclysms and even how biblical traditions were actually referencing cyclical cataclysms rather than the beginning of time, so to speak. Now, what's discussed in this book is the possibility that a magnetic pole shift of a massive variety would be the impetus for a cataclysmic event that basically destroys everything or resets human civilization. And again, as I already talked about, there's also a different take on the Genesis story in this book, suggesting that what was actually depicted or interpreted as the beginning of the world was actually just the beginning of the most recent reset prior to our time, following the last cataclysm. And again, the notion here is that we're coming due for this cyclical cataclysm yet again. And perhaps people suggest that this is something the CIA knows about, and this is why this book was initially classified and then later published, but only with a redacted version available. Now, in terms of additional, potentially corroborating evidence in this regard, I remember Linda Moulton Howe talked about being contacted by someone supposedly in intelligence circles back around 2013 or so, I believe, and he said that the CIA, or intelligence groups anyway, were in knowledge of a coming cataclysm of some sort in the 2020s. And that, interestingly, this lines up with what we've been talking about here in terms of these extraterrestrials and what they're saying, in terms of what experiencers are hearing. Even people like Chris Bledsoe have heard this timelines. in the 2020s going into the 2030s. This is a repeating theme quite often. And by the way, I'd like to point out that to Linda Moulton Howe's credit, she suggested that if indeed we are the people that are here during this massive cataclysmic event, that perhaps we planned this, that we actually meant to be part of this reset, that it's part of what we planned in terms of our soul evolution, that we're not just victims of circumstance. And I think that's actually a really important way to look at this, and I think there's much truth there, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Now, in terms of other potentially corroborating sources that go beyond the UFO phenomenon, I also mentioned how there are hints in the geological record and in the archaeological record. Now, often the mainstream doesn't want to talk about this, the archaeological mainstream, but Graham Hancock has done a lot of great work looking into ancient apocalypses. In fact, he has a new series on Netflix called that, Ancient Apocalypse. And he looks at evidence that previous sophisticated civilizations lived on the earth much earlier than the conventional mainstream is willing to acknowledge, perhaps tens of thousands of years. And he sees this record suggesting that perhaps these cataclysms happen somewhere between every 10 to 12,000 years. And based on when the last one was, again, that would suggest that we're coming due for this again soon. So yet again, we have another piece of evidence potentially suggesting this is the case, lining up in terms of timelines. And in regards to Hancock, I mentioned how he's been frustrated by the mainstream and how they often try to minimize his work and basically try to prevent people from being aware of his work. And this is something that Graham Hancock recently said in this regard in terms of the conventional archaeological mainstream trying to censor his new series on Netflix. He said, quote, "The Society for American Archaeology issues an open letter calling for censorship of my Netflix docuseries Ancient Apocalypse, but when asked to substantiate the claims made in the letter, has quote-unquote no further comment." So Hancock's frustration there, and I tend to agree with him, is that rather than presenting an argument why this series should be censored, they're merely relying on their badges, so to speak, the fact that they are the archaeological mainstream, and saying, we're telling you this should be censored, so just do it. Now, what a lot of this comes down to is the sense that the only reason why there's this really clear sense of what happened in deep human history is that there's this consensus that's just been put forward as truth by the archaeological mainstream. But at best, this is a soft science, and you could even argue it's a pseudoscience. There's a lot of subjective interpretation here, a lot of assumption. And what Hancock is really doing is coming with some different possibilities. He's saying, when we look at the evidence, is there different possibilities that could present themselves here, suggesting perhaps there were previous sophisticated civilizations that were not the first kids on the block, so to speak. And rather than fighting that with evidence, backing up their claims that this should be censored, they merely say, listen, we're the archaeological mainstream, you know what we're talking about, so just do it. So I really think Hancock has a good point here. And to our aim today to talk about this notion of a cataclysm and perhaps even a cyclical cataclysm that is perhaps coming due again soon, again, I think Hancock's done some great work looking at archaeological digs and whatnot, suggesting that this has happened before and that based on the intervals in history, it could very well be happening again soon. And now I'd like to discuss what's known as the raw material or the raw contact material. Now, first of all, I just want to say I think this is great material. I mentioned this on the most recent episode of Liminal Frames. Really, I think this is the best channeled material we've ever come across. I really am appreciative of the three people that were involved in this channel material in the early 1980s. And I find that the messages provided seem very legitimate to me. They also line up with deep spiritual principles from Eastern tradition and non-duality, which I feel has been revealed to me as central to reality. And I'm certainly not the only one. Again, there's a lot of common ground there. So yeah, just as an aside, if you've not read the raw material, I highly suggest you do. It's pretty dense material, but the underlying nuggets of truth are pure gold. And I will do a deep dive into the raw material at some time in the future. Now, this is what I want to say about the raw material. One key question that often goes overlooked in this matter of cataclysms, and even more so in terms of cyclical cataclysms, is whether these are merely natural events that follow the orbital patterns of objects in space or the magnetic meanderings of our planet, or is it that they are connected to the seeding or resetting of the planet by some overarching intelligence who perhaps uses these events as the mechanism by which consciousness is reset. So the focus here is on consciousness, not on these physical events, that these are just the mechanism or the surface layer of what is actually a move in consciousness. I think this is key. I keep returning to this, and the raw material makes this front and center really important. And in that regard, I think it's important to point out that according to the raw material, when these cataclysmic events do happen, when these resetting events do happen, it's not like everything just returns to zero, that according to the physicalist model, for instance, when you're dead, you're dead. That's not the case, that even if the beings on the planet go through one of these cataclysms, again, what's underlyingly the case is that a metaphysical reset is happening, or a metaphysical shift is perhaps a better way to describe it, and the reset is just what it looks like on the physical level. And what that means is, according to the raw material, depending on the level of consciousness of the various people on the planet, they will be repopulated or reincarnated elsewhere, perhaps on the planet if they're ready. When the planet goes to 4D, which is the actual expectation according to the raw material, that again, the entire planet goes to this dimensional shift, and those who are ready go along with it. Others are repopulated elsewhere, perhaps on other planets that are at a sort of 3D stage. So you have this entire metaphysical architecture, you could call it, that underlies these physical events that are really only part of the story, and you really misunderstand the main thrust of the story if you only pay attention to them, which again is one of the implications of a physicalist mindset. And I'm suggesting we get beyond that, and we can look at something like a cataclysm and not look at it with fear and trembling and dismay, because there's deeper things, deeper moves in consciousness going on underlyingly. And now I'd like to leave you with a few concluding thoughts. When we reflect on this notion of the possibility of a coming cataclysm, it's important to keep a few things in mind. Number one, achieving clarity on exactly when this is going to happen, if indeed it is going to take place, is a tricky endeavor. Not the least of which is because, as I already stated, numerous variables seem to be contributing to this. So becoming too focused on this particular matter of when exactly this is going to happen is perhaps ill-advised. Number two, according to much of the relevant experiencer literature, the overarching spiritual principles that underlie this event are more important than the event itself. And these principles speak to natural dimensional progressions that are part of the overarching plan. In other words, there are metaphysical principles seeking for the greater good that underlie any surface layer manifestation, even surface layer manifestations that look negative by themselves. Number three, even if these events are inevitable, and even skeptics to all of these matters will acknowledge that some kind of earth or cosmic cataclysm is indeed going to happen eventually, it's just a matter of when, not if, we still have a key role to play in what ultimately happens to us based on our response to it. Our level of consciousness, both individually and collectively, will play a role in quote-unquote what comes next. Finally, speaking of what comes next, we should keep in mind amidst all of these matters that ultimately the spiritual principles outlined in the best experiencer literature, not to mention in the non-dual teachings of the world's deepest spiritual traditions, all point to the fact that ultimately we are eternal beings experiencing a long line of temporary manifestations like this present earthling one on our path towards ultimate transcendence and reunion with cosmic source. And in that sense, there really is nothing to fear from these local cataclysms. They can do nothing to rob us of what really matters, for the metaphysical reality that undergirds the somewhat illusory nature of this space-time construct can never be destroyed, for it was never created. It just is. And that being the case, what this really comes down to is a question around how we respond to this, and any other challenges, or what the raw material would call catalyst, the resistance we train against in the growing of our individual souls and our shared collective consciousness that come our way. A key element in finding peace with these and any other matters that are concerning within this particular manifestation is to learn to toggle between the relative and absolute aspects of reality. By keeping in mind the absolute, the aspects that are eternal and indestructible and ultimately indivisible, we're able to not only navigate the relative aspects that make up our local space-time experience with grace and strength, but also with this overarching knowledge that whatever lessons we learn in these temporary manifestations are the very lessons that we get to take with us in terms of the deep abiding wisdom that is passed on from one lifetime to the next and also contribute back to Cosmic Source as part of the overarching evolution of the oneness of all that is. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.